Connected Conversations with Lena Petrova. Bridging worlds, one conversation at a time.
Welcome to Connected Conversation. My name is Elena Petrova. I'm founder and CEO of Adastra Inc. We are a leader in global communication and language access. In this podcast, we dive into the journey about communities, challenges, and celebrate visionary leaders who bring positive impact to our communities. And today, I have Ramya Vivekanandan. Do I pronounce your name correctly?
Ramya Vivekanandan.
Thank you for correcting me. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Lena, for having me. It's really a privilege to be here and to have this opportunity. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you. So again, my name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I was born in India, in Chennai, in the south of India, and grew up in the U.S. I was 2 years old when we came to Austin originally, but then I grew up in the suburbs of Dallas. But then I've been in Washington, D.C. off and on since the late 90s. I came here originally for college, went to university here, and then eventually got into a career in international development and education, which has taken me all over the world. I've lived in different parts of Africa, in Malawi, in Guinea, in Senegal. And then I went to Paris, where I lived for 6 years, then to Bangkok for 5 years, and then moved back to the States 7 years ago. So I work in international development and education. I'm also a mom. I've got an 11-year-old son. And as of a couple of years ago, I am also a writer. I think I've also always been a writer, but I've been devoting time and attention to that in the past couple of years, and that's been really a joy.
That's incredible. And you just got back from Rwanda, correct?
That's correct. Yes, I was on a work trip. A very inspiring full week that I had in Rwanda.
Incredible. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. You were born in India. You came to US. You were 4 years old. Then you traveled around the world, and you involved in community improvement. What I am curious to talk about a little bit, because you have perspective from different cultures, right? So because US is very individualistic culture, yet you have experience living and growing up in India, which is very community-oriented culture. In your opinion, how it all influence your view on community and approaching helping people to prosper in various communities, and impact that brings positive change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So as mentioned, I was born in India and grew up here in the States from a very young age. And I think growing up here as an immigrant, that meant that, what I encountered outside of the house, at school, was very different from within the home. So, two different languages, but also, different food, different dress, different customs, and really two different worldviews, I think ultimately. And like you said, Indian culture being very much oriented in sort of a more collective way of doing things, and kind of the importance of family and community. And the U.S. And, this was, in the 1980s in suburban Dallas, Texas, right? So it was just very different, very individualistic, as you say. But I think ultimately for me, I saw that, there's at least two very different ways of being in the world. And I think I've always been, since I was very young, just a naturally curious person. And so I always figured, I think, there must be other ways of being in the world and other ways to do life. So I think I was always curious to learn more and to experience more of the world. I had the good fortune of going back and forth to India, as I was growing up, and some other travel, not very much when I was younger. But I think I always had this notion that there was more to the world than just what is in front of me. And I think a lot of that does come from my upbringing and being an immigrant, like I said. And indeed, that has inspired, I think, my journey and, the career path that I chose in terms of working in development internationally. Because I think also in traveling and spending time in India, et cetera, I realized on the one hand, how much privilege I have, how much privilege we have, most of us here, in terms of education, but, even beyond that. And so I think I always, from the time I was young, had a desire to do something to make sure that other people could have some of those same privileges that I did and that I do. I think also growing up and, spending time in other places made me pretty aware from a young age, how small I am or any of us are. We're just kind of one dot in a very vast universe, So I think that orientation came definitely from the way that I grew up and being able to be a person of the world, if you will.
So you're saying that you view yourself as a person of the world, and that comes from the fact that you had this view coming from completely two different cultures, correct?
I think so. Yeah, that was definitely a big part of it.
Do you see any challenges that was coming from this background? Because sometimes when I talk to people who grew up in the US but had background from or heritage or were born outside of US, they have problems with the belonging to one side or another. Did you have any problems with the identity?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say problems, but definitely challenges. I think being a brown person, in predominantly spaces that weren't, certainly being a girl, being a woman, and yeah, just kind of constantly having to navigate, I guess, those differences. So I think nowadays, we're a much more sort of global community, at least, that's what I see in my son and his friends. But when I was growing up, things were very much kind of, like I said, the culture that I, grew up in at home, but then everything in the outside world. So I found, that oftentimes I had to, what they call code switch, in terms of like how I would communicate, say with family members or people in the Indian community versus, how like in school or with teachers or with other people. So I think, yeah, like living in like duality, was a challenge, but something that I think that all people that immigrate or that migrate, they sort of have to learn that, because you have to hold those two different kind of truths, and go in between them all the time.
Do you think it's getting better today?
It's a tough one because I think, certainly here in the U.S., things are pretty complicated right now, without getting into further detail about that. But I think that there is, and again, it depends where you are, right? But in a place like Washington, D.C., where we're sitting here, I think we're naturally exposed to different cultures and, people coming from, other parts of the world. I think even in terms of, what we see these days on television, in restaurant menus, the music that we listen to, we're a much more globalized society, certainly than the 1980s. So I think that's quite beneficial in terms of, some of the challenges that I navigated when I was younger. It would be very different, I suppose, today. But at the same time, a lot of those challenges still remain, I think in terms of, how you translate between different ways of life, how you find, what's the common ground. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, even in terms of like some of the issues that we're facing today as a country and really as the world.
You travel a lot and you walk in different communities across the globe. What challenges do you see today that you would say the common challenge across the different communities internationally?
That's a that's a large question. I think maybe one huge challenge. I'll go into this one because this is the field in which I work. But actually, I think it cuts across so many different challenges. But it's ultimately, education to me is the basis of all development, personal development, of course, but also the development of communities and societies. And in many parts of the world, I work primarily with lower income countries. And in many of these countries, you have, for example, 10-year-olds that, have been in school for a number of years that cannot read and understand a simple paragraph. In Africa, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 90% of 10-year-olds can't read and understand a simple paragraph. So that's huge, and I think that has such ramifications, not only for those individuals and their own families, but in terms of all the lost potential. Because, if you are not able to read or write or do basic maths, your life possibilities are so restricted as a result. And I think, beyond, lower income countries or talking about, being able to read, I think education in general is the heart of, development, like I said. And even in this country, I know that we have a lot of challenges in terms of what children learn, what they don't learn. So much of the kind of fractured nature of society right now, I think, is because we don't teach kids, important skills such as being able to cooperate and to understand and appreciate diversity, to think about what it means to be a citizen. That's all education too. I mean, education plays a large role in all of those things. And a lot of the sort of tensions that we see between, political parties, between individuals, I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. How do you think we can address education globally?
Well, I think, the challenges are so context specific, right? So, in, country X, it's maybe, that 90% of your 10-year-olds can't read. Whereas somewhere else, maybe it's more around civics or, STEM. So, it's hard to, I guess, generalize. But I think for me, the common sort of rallying point would be the notion that education is about creating individuals that can thrive in community. So that means thriving means that they themselves have the skills that they need to get, good work, to be able to provide for their families, et cetera. But in community means that they also have to have, those other skills, such as being able to, think critically, solve problems, appreciate people that are different from them. And that, I think, is the real challenge, is how do you, as an education system, have that orientation, that sort of whole individual orientation.
I know that you're very big on education because you and I chatted earlier, and I know that you got very inspired. Who was your inspiration?
So if I had to sort of name one person, it would be my maternal grandmother. Who she was, just a really inspiring, amazing woman. She was married at the age of 16 to my grandfather, who at the time was a widower, and he had, 3 young children himself. So she had to, as was the norm in the culture at that time in India and South India, take care of, him, his parents, these 3 young kids. Over the course of her own life, she had 10 children of her own, only 4 of whom, survived, the youngest being my mom. because, back in those days in India, child mortality rates were really high. There was, disease and epidemics, etc. So she herself actually never learned to read or write. She was illiterate. The choices that she had in her life were vastly different than the ones that I've had, than the ones that my mom had. And, that's because of education, too. So I think that I was maybe around 6 years old, and it was on a trip back to India that I realized, in fact, that she didn't know how to read, which was a surprise because she was such a strong woman, But I think knowing that and also seeing around me in India, so many kids working in, train stations or in the rice paddies or, in factories instead of going to school, that just made me really sad. And I thought, someday maybe I can do something to address this. The idea being that, everyone deserves an education, and girls and women in particular are excluded in so many parts of the world still, So I think from a young age wanted to work in that field.
So you find your inspiration and motivation from your grandmother's story, and for me it's the same. I was very inspired by my grandmother, and I remember one of the things that she was always saying to me, Lina, people can take everything from you, but there is one thing, is your education. So she was always pushing me to go and get to school. And there is also a statistic that shows that educated women across the world, those are the drivers of economy, no matter which country they are. Because if you give or donate money to women within communities who are educated, they are going to start investing in families and development of the communities. What is your experience? Because again, you travel, you see the communities, and you see and you're involved in the project development.
Yeah, no, that's I think women hold up the sky. No matter where we were talking. Educated women, like you say, are more likely to ensure that their own kids go to school and stay in school. They're the ones that take care typically of their family's, health. So educated women, are more likely to contribute to the health of their children and of their communities, to save money, to contribute to livelihood. So, that's really the cornerstone, I think, it's certainly been my experience, and I've seen that all over the world.
So tell us about the project that you worked in any community in any country that you can see today that that brought the change that you're very proud of.
So it's not something that I was involved in myself, but an organization with which I collaborated. So I worked for over a decade with UNESCO, which is the UN Specialized Agency for Education. And this is when I was based in Bangkok, but supporting countries throughout the Asia Pacific. So back in India, in fact, there's an organization called Pratham. It's actually the largest NGO working in education in India. And amongst many other things, they do something that they call citizen-led assessment, which is essentially mobilizing ordinary citizens, ordinary members of the community, to actually go into individual households and to give a very simple test to the kids that live in that household. Simple, passage for them to read, some simple maths. And the idea is that this can spur action, because what happened in India, this is now quite some time ago, people, I think, had an assumption that because they're sending their kids to school, India, like many developing countries, has made massive strides in terms of expanding access to education. But people, particularly parents and communities that maybe weren't so well educated themselves, were sort of assuming that because the kids were going to school that they were learning. But what they found out by doing these simple tests is that, well, not necessarily. Because, as I was alluding to before, there are, a number of kids that are 10, 12, 15 years old that actually were not able to do simple maths or, read even, 2 or 3 sentences correctly. But the fact of having like ordinary citizens actually doing the test and seeing this for themselves spurred action, in so many different villages and communities. And ultimately that sort of, I think, reverberated up to the policy level nationally, where in India there's, I think, much more of an emphasis on learning, quality of education, etc. So I didn't actually work for this organization, but with UNESCO, we had a partnership with them. And so I got to go out to a couple of the villages in a western state in India and, do some of those assessments myself. And that was just really, inspiring just to see the way that they mobilize community to act, to advocate in favor of improving the education system.
What did you see the major improvement that was achieved there?
So I think, it just kind of, when they presented this data sort of at a national scale, I think it served as a wake-up call in many respects. And I've seen similar things in other places in terms of, data is so powerful, right? Like evidence and having the numbers. So I think there were a number of different policy measures that were put into place to, really support teachers, to ensure that there were enough books, to ensure that children, instead of, having them, in most school systems around the world, children are organized by age and by grade level, right? But sometimes, particularly in some of these, lower income contexts, but maybe not only, being in, say, 4th grade, you could have big variety, big range of abilities. So, they did an intervention where they would group the kids according to their ability level rather than the grade. So the idea being to kind of meet them where they're at. So lots of small things like that, I shouldn't say small, lots of different innovations, in fact, I think came as a result of that wake-up call and having that data.
That's very interesting. What do you think? Do you think something that from that lesson, do you think here in US we can learn something, and that something could be implemented here that would bring positive change from that lesson?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, education in the US is a bit of a, it's complex because we don't have necessarily a national system, right? We have, individual school districts. It's based very much on local sort of framework. But I think it's still, I definitely see, some resonance because, again, it was data and it was ordinary people being confronted with the reality. And I think that's important regardless of, the context, because we need data. We need to have an understanding of, what's actually happening in schools. But, one could say the same thing about any sector, right? We need that evidence in order to decide how to act on the problem. And then the fact that they mobilize the community specifically, I think that that's so important, wherever you are, because these are our kids, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This is our future.
Precisely. The way that I look at it, any community can learn from each other. And no matter, I think, we talk about these low-income countries, but in my opinion, those communities have been through some challenges that there is a lot to learn from. And when those lessons that you're talking about bring data, this data is precious to us too, because there is nothing that we have ever done here.
Yes. No, absolutely. I agree with you 100%.
Right. And that leads me to my next question, because you participated in a community project in Jamaica. How did you decide to go there? Because I think that you took your son there too.
Yes, no, that's quite a story. So 3 years ago, I went on holiday to this place called Treasure Beach on the south coast of Jamaica. And this was upon the recommendation of one of my best friends who had visited before, a number of years before, and said, "Oh, you should really check this place out. You know, you would really like it. It would be totally up your alley." And so I went and I discovered just the most magical community, very unique in Jamaica, and I think in the Caribbean more broadly, because it's very much built around a model of what they call community-based tourism. So essentially that means that in a lot of these places, you know, you as a tourist, you go to maybe an all-inclusive resort, or you spend your time on, you know, a private beach. You don't have that opportunity to have that interaction with the actual local community. And this is just a very unique place where you don't have those kind of barriers. And it's the kind of place that, you know, if you come back a second time, they don't even consider you to be a tourist anymore. You know, that you're, you know, an extended member of the community. So I fell in love with this place, and then kept going back, you know, just as a visitor.
So you became local.
Yeah, well, a part of that expanded community, right?
Right.
And brought my son, indeed, and, you know, he loved it too. I mean, it's for an 11-year-old, it's a great place to go on vacation, you know, getting to play on the beach and ride in the boat and go fishing and, you know, things like that. But this summer, very unfortunately, the Treasure Beach and Jamaica in general was very badly impacted by Hurricane Beryl. So that was actually, I think, the earliest Category 5, I believe, or Category 4 hurricane in the Atlantic in, you know, over 100 years. So I think it's, you know, it was a very visible manifestation of climate change, you know, with the warming temperatures of the ocean and so forth. So we had actually already made plans to go and spend 3 weeks there, you know, prior to the hurricane actually hitting. But then this happened, and you know, I guess the logical thing to do would have been to cancel, to reschedule, or, you know, go somewhere else. But then ultimately, you know, I think I had become so attached to this community and to the wonderful people there that I thought, let's just go ahead and maintain our plans, and, you know, maybe there's something that we can do to help out. So that's what we did.
So tell us a little bit, what did you and your son exactly, what was the project? What did you participate? What was the challenge and success?
So, like I said, this is an amazing community. And, you know, the hurricane really mashed things up, as I would say, in that part of the world. You know, so many people lost their roofs or had extensive damage to their homes, to their businesses. Electricity, internet service, phone service, all of that was gone, and took quite some time to come back. But there is a really sort of vibrant civil society over there, you know, with a number of different community organizations and some really amazing individuals, in fact, who are leaders of that community. And so they mobilized quite quickly. And, you know, they...
Yeah, I'm curious. So when you say mobilize, because I think we have a lot to learn from it. So Adastro right now is participating in the project in the state of Georgia. And it wasn't easy to mobilize people because in our case, we have a lot of people who do not speak the same language. And the language access, the communication was a challenge. What challenges did you guys have? Any particular challenges that you had to you went through when you were mobilizing people?
So we weren't there on the ground when the hurricane actually struck. I think we arrived there maybe like 3 weeks or so afterwards. But I understand and, you know, can imagine that in the immediate aftermath, you know, infrastructure itself was probably the biggest challenge. There wasn't safe water to drink. There were power lines and electricity poles that were down. Even being able to go drive down the road was difficult. So I know that they kind of focused on all of that first. But this is kind of a unique place because it's a very small community. It's a rural area, in fact. So the scale, I guess, is different. They also unfortunately have had lots of experience. Jamaica being of course having a number of hurricanes and tropical storms and things like that. So they activated actually sort of the plans or kind of the response that they had started like back in 2004, from what I understand, when there was another major hurricane. I think it was Ivan, if I'm not mistaken, whereby, different community groups would come together and they would have every morning like a coordinating meeting. Just to be able to say, who's doing what, to kind of divide up, the work, so to speak. And so they did that again, in fact, because I think they realized, like there's a women's group there, for example. And, they decided that maybe they're the ones that are best placed to go into some of the more distant areas to distribute food, clothing, care packages, that kind of thing. Whereas, someone else was going to be charged with assessing the damages to the homes. And so, I think it was divide and conquer and coordination. But, all of that, I think, is thanks to some really amazing leaders, individuals that were really at the forefront of all of that. So we were there just as visitors, to support. But I mean, it's the amazing community there that really made a difference.
And everything was done by a local community?
So because this place is so special and wonderful, they, I'm, one of many, many people who have been to Treasure Beach and who has fallen in love with the place. And so there is this global community of visitors all over the world who I think were on the front lines in terms of making donations.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, they worked with an organization called the American Friends of Jamaica that was able to, accept donations here to channel to the community foundation on the ground there. But then they also had some global organizations like World Central Kitchen, Global Empowerment Mission that also provided support. So, there were kind of different aspects to it.
What do you think was the major success of that project, if we can call it project?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, we spent 3 weeks there, like I said, in the aftermath. And it was just so eye-opening, because, I mean, I'd never been sort of in a post-disaster zone myself. But just seeing, like I said, the collaboration, the cooperation between different groups, I think that was a big lesson for me, that, how important that is in this kind of a scenario. Also, like I said, those individuals, those community leaders who were at the forefront of the response, I think led me to reflect a lot about, I've been working for over 20 years at the global level with, large organizations that work kind of more at a policy or systems level. And I think that that's so important. But here, I mean, there in Jamaica, I saw that, it was an effort that was largely led by individuals and community groups. And so that was a powerful lesson for me, I think, in terms of, the importance of both, certainly. But in this case, it was really coming from the community, from the ground up, the response. I think it's also a place where they have naturally always thought about the environment. And, when you live in a hurricane zone, I think that's sort of endemic to how you organize your life, trying to conserve resources and be climate conscious. But, it's certainly was the first manifestation that I experienced of the consequences of climate change. And then lastly, I mean, I think another big takeaway for me was just around, I mean, it's going to sound a little bit cheesy, I guess, but like the love actually that like underpinned the whole response. Because I think even, even though people had a lot of loss and pain, people were smiling and laughing and, still trying to have a good time. And because, I think there's a recognition that you need that, you need joy, you need love, you need connection. Yeah.
That makes me very happy when I see that. Do you think it's something that is very particular to Jamaican culture, or have you seen it across the globe when you travel in other communities?
Yeah, I think no. I think it's a human thing.
It's a human thing, yeah.
I mean, I think certainly
it's a good vibe to have on Friday afternoon.
yes. No, I think it's just it's human nature. It's a strategy. When in the face of adversity or difficulty. I mean, certainly on a personal level, I think, when I've gone through challenging circumstances, I've always tried to lean into humor and, connection with others. And I think that's just kind of a natural human instinct. You hear about, these stories, even in the most difficult of circumstances, right? So I think, this is probably the strategy. This is the key to making it through. Yeah.
And your son witnessed all of it.
He did. Yeah. That was an interesting experience because he's traveled a lot, just by virtue of, my own lifestyle. But I think it was probably the first time that, he's been in a place, especially for a sustained period of time, where, there wasn't always Wi-Fi or, like the air conditioning wasn't working and there were, these horrible mosquitoes. So, he's a tween, right? So he definitely complained a little bit sometimes. But I think ultimately, it was really like, I don't think he'll forget this experience because I think he also realized how lucky he is, how lucky we are, how much we take for granted, and how... simply being in a place that you care about at a time that, they're going through something difficult, that is a lot, because I think people really appreciated just our presence as friends. So that was definitely meaningful for him, I think.
It's incredible. We need our children to see that and learn from it. And then I know that you wrote a blog about this trip and you keep writing. Tell us about your blog. And how did you start writing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think I've always had a penchant for words. I've always been writing in some form. I remember in second grade, I wrote a play called The Royal Family. I even remember the title. And my teacher really liked it and wanted the class to perform it. I wrote a small book of poetry, around the same time. I used to have a food blog back in the day. Back in the years that I, worked in Africa, I used to send kind of long missives, to friends and families to, describe, what I was experiencing. So, I've always written, in some way. But it was a couple of years ago that, again, I was in Jamaica and just realized that I wanted to, make that a more sustained part of my life. So I decided to launch a newsletter using the Substack platform, and it's called 44 Revolutions. Welcome new readers, of course. But initially, it was just around I wanted to share with people the things that inspire me or give me pause. So whether that's, a podcast or music or a recipe or beauty product. I mean, it was in the beginning, it was just sending out a monthly bulletin, kind of rounding up like different, things that I had encountered over the course of that month. But then always signed off with a poem because I write poetry and, it gives me a lot of joy. So it's, it's evolved since then. I write more personal essays now, and then trying to experiment with different genres. It's something that's a pure passion project at this point, but which I really love.
And where can we find your blog? Because I know that you continue writing. What are your goals for the future? How do you envision your writing, your blog to impact your work in the future?
Yeah, so I want to write and publish more regularly, and can certainly share the address with anyone that's interested. But it's Ramya Vivekanandan, my name, .substack.com. And I've been also exploring there. Like I said, I've been writing more personal essays. And so some of the themes that we've been touching on here, that experience this summer in Jamaica, I wrote about. I've written about my grandmother and what it means to be literate, and what writing has meant for me, tying it into the work that I've done with the community, internationally, et cetera. So I see it kind of as a place to kind of tie all the threads together, I guess, essentially. And like I said, it's just something that just brings me joy. I like expressing myself. I love words. I read a lot as well. So yeah, no, I hope to devote more time and attention to this going forward.
And is there any particular project that you're currently working on that you can share with us?
Well,
yeah, all going into holiday season.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to be interested to do some community projects.
Yeah, I think, the notion of community is actually an interesting one, right? Because I think it's a word that we use a lot, and maybe we, don't really unpack it to really understand what we mean by that. Because I think community can be so many different things and on so many different levels, right? And at its essence, I think it's about a group of individuals that are united by some common thing. So maybe that's geography. So it's about, we're in Washington, D.C., so that's our community. But, maybe it's your neighborhood. Maybe it's speaking a common language or holding, a same belief in something. But I think, looking towards the holidays, when people do think about community and giving, I think, so I've had the good fortune and privilege, I think, of being able to be in community at different levels, right? Certainly in my work internationally, I talked about the Jamaica experience, some other places. I'm a member of the community here as well. But I think ultimately, people might be more inclined to lean into one or more, of those things, levels rather. So I think it's really about thinking about, where do you want to make a difference as an individual or, as a family? What is the cause or what is the group that resonates the most with you? And then trying to think about, what is your own mix of skills, talents, aptitudes, resources, time that would enable you to make a contribution. So, of course, that will look very different for each person.
And I have to ask you this question. How many languages do you speak?
I probably not as many as you, I'm guessing. I speak 3 languages fluently, and then dabble in a few. So English, of course, Tamil, which is the first language that I learned. I didn't learn English until I was 4. French, and my Portuguese is pretty decent, so I guess 3.5. And a few words in a number of other languages.
It is like once you started talking about communities, I had to ask you this question.
Of course. Of course, yeah. And language, and can I just say, the work that you do, I think is so important because words matter, right? And sometimes language, is a barrier, right? It is a barrier when we don't have the same words and ability to communicate. But, the fact that you bring people together, that you provide the channels for, different types of individuals to communicate, I think that's such important work.
It can be a barrier, but it also can be the reason why people get together, right?
Yes.
Because like today, so many people are thinking, oh, we have a technology. Like very soon, we do not need. Very soon, we are going to have maybe like 3 dominant languages, and all the rest will disappear. I personally do not believe in that. I think that language is our identity,
Yes.
and people really need to keep that.
Absolutely.
So, okay, well, I think that your conversation was so inspirational, particularly when you talk about education, you talk about travel, you talk about integration in different local communities. Your story about Jamaica was definitely very inspiring. And around holiday season, a lot of us want to go and help and make a positive change. If there is one actionable step that you would recommend somebody to start, somebody who have never done it before, what that would be?
Yeah. So I think it's, again, like I said, there are different communities. We belong to different communities, different levels. So I think it's about thinking about reflecting upon, which is the community that is most important to you, that resonates most strongly. And then asking what it is that you can do to make a difference in that community. So, again, that varies so much from person to person. During the holidays, I know that those that have the means, might be making some kind of a charitable contribution, to a favorite charity. So that's great. But I think also if you have a particular interest in a certain cause or in a certain place, then it's worth exploring, what is it that, you might be able to do, and we all have really busy lives, right? So it's not that, everyone can contribute the same amount of time. But I think we all have, a role to play when it comes to the places and the spaces that matter to us. So it's just trying to figure out, I think, what's the most important to you, and how can you best make a contribution there.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for all the work that you do around the globe.
Thank you, too. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for everything that you do as well.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. Perfect. And, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for going on this journey with us. We are very interested to hear what next story you would like to hear. Please leave this in the comment section, and we are looking forward to hear from you. Thank you.